Welcome to the Mind Cut series.
Hey there.
We're jumping straight into a deep dive today. We've got some really powerful excerpts from an interview. It's all centered around a book called Intuition, Boundaries, and Healing After Loss.
That's right. And we've really gone through this material and, well, our mission here is to get right to the heart of it. We want to unpack not just what things like personal growth or setting boundaries look like, but crucially, the why. The reasoning behind it all.
And the how, like the actual practical steps involved in healing, especially after, profound loss.
Exactly. It's about the why and the how.
And what makes this material so compelling, I think, is that it's just so steeped in lived experience. You can feel it.
Totally. It shows how actually going through these really intense personal challenges can forge these, well, deep insights.
It's almost like a shortcut, isn't it, to understanding some pretty deep truths about ourselves, and it's wrapped up in some surprisingly relatable stories. So yeah, let's dive in.
Let's do it. Where should we start? Boundaries.
Yeah, let's start with boundaries. The source material really kicks off with this powerful moment of realization, that people-pleasing. It's often just a one-way street.
Oh, absolutely. That feeling when it clicks, that putting yourself second all the time.
Yeah.
It's just not sustainable. It really isn't.
It connects to this idea that boundaries aren't about being mean or selfish. They're actually necessary for your sanity, for self-respect.
Yeah, and often that realization doesn't happen in a vacuum, does it? It comes from a contrast. You look at what you're doing, the effort you're putting out,
right?
And then you see others and you notice, hang on, they have boundaries you don't seem to have.
And the source makes this really sharp point. Think about the people demanding things from you. If you turned around and asked them to do the exact same thing for you,
would they say yes?
Exactly. And often the honest answer is a quick no.
Which isn't always because they're bad people, right?
Yeah.
It's just they have a boundary.
A boundary you haven't maybe articulated or enforced for yourself yet.
Yeah. And this leads to a really important distinction the source brings up. What's the difference between chronic people-pleasing and genuinely just wanting people around you to be happy?
That's a tricky one.
It is. But the key insight from the source is this. You actually cannot control someone else's happiness. You just can't.
Right. There are so many things that feed into it.
Exactly. And it's not your job, it's not your responsibility to somehow make another person happy.
It's kind of an impossible task anyway, isn't it, when you think about it?
Totally impossible. And realizing that, well, it frees you up. It lets you see that your own happiness, your own well-being, they're valid too. Super important, actually.
Which brings you right back around to needing those boundaries.
Yep. And the source gives us such a brilliant, concrete example of this in action. The anecdote about the grandfather and the warm Guinness.
Oh, yes. That one's perfect. Bringing this thoughtful gift, a nice bottle of Guinness.
And the reaction is just, put it in the freezer. Rude.
Totally rude. And the response wasn't just to sigh and do it, which is what maybe the old pattern would have been.
Right. The response was, actually, no. I'm going home now. You can put it in the freezer yourself. That was completely rude.
And then actually leaving. Following through on it.
That's the key part. And then what happened? The grandfather kept calling. And when the call was finally picked up, the boundary was just stated again, firmly. Look, I'm not coming back until you apologize. That was rude.
And he did, right, when the person eventually went back.
He had made breakfast, cleaned up, done things he normally needed nagging for.
Yeah.
And he apologized.
Wow. Okay, so the boundary actually worked.
It worked. And then they had that really essential follow-up conversation, setting the new rule, basically.
Saying, look, moving forward, this can't happen again. I can't care for you and deplete my own energy doing it. It's just not sustainable.
Exactly. So what does this mean for you listening? This story really shows why enforcing boundaries is so crucial.
Yeah, the source really emphasizes how it builds your confidence, your self-respect, standing by your word.
And it stops you from enabling behavior that honestly isn't good for anyone involved.
It's framed as self-love, isn't it? Putting those limits in place so you don't just burn yourself out completely.
Yeah, protecting your energy. And the source has this interesting idea that people will kind of meet you where you're at energetically.
What do you mean?
You decide the level. Are you going to rise up to match their maybe demanding or negative energy? Or are you going to hold your ground, meaning they have to meet your energy level?
Okay. I see. So you set the standard.
You set the standard. So the big takeaway here, really driven home by that story, is that boundaries aren't selfish. They're about self-preservation.
And kind of paradoxically, they can actually make relationships stronger, right? By building that foundation of respect.
Absolutely. When people know where the lines are, things often get healthier.
Okay, so this whole idea of navigating tricky family stuff, difficult relationships, it flows really nicely into the next big theme from the sources: forgiveness and healing, generational pain.
Yeah, this is deep stuff. There's this incredibly powerful story shared in the source about hearing really, really hurtful words as a child.
The "they don't love you" line.
That's the one. Said by a grandparent at age 4. And the source describes it so vividly, like feeling the physical impact of words for the very first time.
That pain in the chest, feeling like your heart would split.
Yeah. A memory that just sticks with you. And the source says it felt like it stole a huge chunk of innocence. Introduced this kind of sadness and hurt that a little kid just shouldn't have to deal with.
And the source paints this picture of the grandfather as someone who, well, lived a life that often came across as selfish, seemingly didn't care much about the hurt he caused.
But it's explained in the source as him kind of just providing what he himself experienced, living out the patterns he knew.
Which suggests maybe a lack of emotional intelligence, or perhaps it's that generational trauma pattern we hear about.
Could be. The source notes that, for his generation, saying sorry, especially to a child, that just wasn't really the done thing.
Right. So this sets up this incredibly tough situation, one that I think a lot of listeners might actually recognize in their own lives.
Definitely.
Being asked or feeling obligated to care for the very person who inflicted these really deep early wounds. How do you even manage that?
It's a huge challenge. But what's really striking is the path that the source describes choosing: radical forgiveness and empathy.
How did that come about?
Well, the request to care for the grandfather actually came from the mother as she herself was dying.
Wow.
Yeah. And while there was initial hesitation, understandably, the realization kind of dawned that this act of caregiving, it wasn't just about the grandfather.
What was it about then?
It was framed as an investment in the future self, a final lesson, almost, in forgiveness passed down from the mother.
Okay, so a legacy of sorts.
Exactly. And actually caring for him, well, it required putting those new boundaries we just talked about into practice.
Right, you have to.
And it meant standing up for oneself, navigating all the complicated family stuff that happens, especially during grief. But through that process, through helping him physically, spending that time together, trust actually started to build.
Really? Even after everything?
Apparently so. They had these deep conversations where the grandfather started sharing his reasons, his justifications for things.
Were they good reasons?
The source says maybe not good justifications, but his honesty, his transparency. It led to a kind of respect.
Interesting.
And you have to think about the bravery involved there. For someone who's 90 years old, probably very set in their ways.
Yeah.
Maybe from a culture where admitting fault or showing vulnerability just isn't common, to actually admit where they went wrong and apologize, especially to someone much younger. It's huge.
That takes immense courage. Absolutely.
It really does. And the outcome described is this profound sense of peace, like it is well, closing that chapter.
And crucially, the source frames it as breaking a cycle, ending that potential curse of passing the pain forward.
Yes. By choosing forgiveness, choosing to heal, the source suggests you can then actually focus on the better memories, maybe from those later years.
Instead of being weighed down by all the anger from the past.
Exactly. You're not carrying it anymore.
And there's a really key insight here for listeners, I think. It's about prioritizing the virtue of forgiveness over how you happen to feel in that specific moment.
Explain that a bit more.
Well, the source connects it to the bigger picture. It suggests that actively pursuing virtues, like forgiveness, might actually be the only real path to long-term happiness.
As opposed to just chasing what feels good right now, or immediate comfort.
Precisely. Because if you just go for comfort without doing the hard work of healing, that bitterness, that pain, it's still there under the surface, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And the source offers this really useful framework, thinking about 3 ways people tend to deal with pain.
Okay.
You have those who repeat it, inflict it on others, then those who swing to the complete opposite extreme.
Right.
And then the third group, those who actively heal from it, and then make a conscious choice to give others the kindness or support they themselves never received.
And choosing that third path, the source presents that as actively protecting your future self, making an investment in your own peace down the line.
Exactly right. It's powerful stuff.
Okay, so we've talked about relationships with others, complex family stuff. Let's shift focus now. Let's talk about that crucial relationship we have with ourselves. The source really dives into reconnecting with our intuition.
Ah, yes, that inner voice. That gut feeling.
That quiet guide that the source suggests can be there from a really young age, trying to steer us.
Yeah, and the sources really draw this contrast, don't they, between following what everyone else thinks you should do, your parents' vision, society's expectations, versus making choices that are guided by that internal compass, that feeling of what's truly right for you.
There's that great example about choosing A levels, right? Picking the subjects that actually felt right, even if parents were worried or had other ideas.
Exactly. And the source says that ACT, even though it seems maybe small in hindsight, it actually built courage. It built the ability to, quote, back yourself.
To trust your own judgment.
Yeah. And the why behind listening to this voice, the source makes it pretty clear. Ignoring that internal guidance often leads you down the wrong path, leads to mistakes.
Whereas paying attention to it, really listening, that tends to lead towards the best decisions for you personally.
But this brings up a really common question, I think. What if you feel like you have ignored that voice for years maybe, and now it feels quiet, like it's gone silent?
Yeah, that's a real feeling for a lot of people.
And the source points out how common it is for us to just outsource our decisions. We're constantly asking friends, family, scrolling social media, looking for answers out there.
Instead of looking inward, we kind of dread the silence, don't we? So we fill it up.
We fill it with noise, with external opinions. So the big question is, how do we turn the volume back up on that inner voice? How do we reconnect?
Okay, practical steps. What does the source suggest?
Well, first things first, remove distractions. Makes sense, right? The more external noise cluttering things up, the harder it is to hear that internal signal.
So less scrolling, maybe less constant input.
Probably. And then, crucially, spend time alone, in solitude.
Like proper alone time?
Yeah. Simple things even. Going for a walk, but without headphones this time. Just allowing yourself to be with your own thoughts, whatever they are.
Okay. And then there's the writing part.
Yes. The practice of just writing down any thought that pops into your head during that quiet time. No judgment, even if it's negative or weird.
And then asking why.
Gently asking why about those thoughts. It's described not just as journaling, but as actively building a communication channel with yourself, like learning to speak your own internal language again.
That's an interesting way to put it.
And the source has this really fascinating take on developing this relationship with your intuition. It suggests it might even test you at first.
Test you?
Like maybe if you don't listen fully, it might let you make a small mistake, a little stumble. And most people get discouraged at that point. They give up.
Oh, okay.
But the source frames that as the test. Your intuition needs to know it can trust you, that you're dependable, that you will listen when it speaks up. It needs that commitment.
So it's like building trust in any relationship.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And there are other specific practices mentioned too to strengthen that connection. Journaling, like we said, capturing those subconscious whispers. Any kind of exercise or movement can help too. Sort of clears the mental clutter.
Right. Gets you out of your head.
Exactly.
Right.
And then there's something quite intense mentioned, fasting, specifically water fasting.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, the source describes this as having the potential to make that inner voice loud as hell, like really clear. And maybe even quieting down that negative self-talk after maybe 3 days or so.
Interesting. So it creates clarity.
Apparently. And then, of course, the more perhaps accessible practices like meditation and breath work. Pushing through that initial restlessness, that discomfort of just sitting with yourself, that creates the space, the stillness you need to actually hear what that inner guide is trying to tell you.
So pulling this together, the message from the source seems to be that this inner guide, this intuition, it's always there. It's potentially your best friend.
Yeah, but like any important friendship, it needs time, it needs nurturing, devotion even.
And it's presented as something different from just fear or anxiety, right? It's deeper than that.
Definitely. It has this protective quality, this sense of deeper knowing. It's about actively choosing to cultivate that relationship, to listen in.
Okay, finally, we need to talk about grief, navigating those really deep, often turbulent waters.
Yeah, and the source material here describes loss on just an immense scale. It's quite overwhelming, actually.
It really is. It talks about multiple overlapping losses happening in a really short space of time. A mother, a father.
And then multiple friends, community members, elders. I think the source mentioned 16 people lost to one illness alone, plus others on top of that. The sheer volume is just staggering.
Unimaginable, really. And the immediate impact was just huge. Finding yourself suddenly becoming a carer while you're already drowning in your own grief.
Yeah, having to somehow push your own feelings down, put them aside, just to be present for a loved one who is transitioning. That's incredibly hard.
And just the heartbreak of watching someone you love decline.
Devastating. And the source describes the personal toll so powerfully. That feeling of like you took your last breath when your mother took hers.
That cold, hollow feeling inside. Like your essence, your spark, just left with them.
Yeah. And then layer on top of that all the practical nightmares. Dealing with closed borders during the pandemic, trying to manage logistics.
Navigating difficult family dynamics that often flare up during these times.
Finding yourself completely alone in a foreign country while all this is unfolding. And the physical toll, too. The source mentions significant weight loss, stress leading to an actual breakdown.
And then eventually having to return to a place that was home, but now every corner, every cent just holds memories of the people who are gone. That must be incredibly difficult.
Brutal. Just brutal.
So, okay, what comes after that? After that initial crushing wave of grief and chaos, the source talks about rebuilding.
Yeah, the absolute necessity of it. Having to rebuild yourself piece by painful piece, learning how to parent yourself through it.
Finding ways to show yourself love and compassion when maybe you feel completely empty.
And consciously having to find a reason to keep going, a reason to be alive. Even achievements like releasing a book, as mentioned in the source, they feel different.
How so?
Because your biggest cheerleader, maybe your parent, isn't there to celebrate with you, so you're forced to become your own cheerleader, to find that validation from within.
That makes sense. And does this kind of profound loss change how you view relationships?
The source suggests it really can. It acts like a filter. You become much more focused on your own safety, your own well-being. You might have less tolerance for relationships that don't feel supportive or beneficial.
That makes sense. It sharpens your focus on what truly matters.
Absolutely. Which leads to a really big question for anyone listening. How can you possibly prepare for a loss like that? Losing a parent, for instance.
What does the source say? Can you prepare?
Honestly, the source is pretty clear. Nothing can truly prepare you.
Yeah.
Especially if you had a close, loving relationship. The shock, the pain, it's immense.
Is there any practical advice?
Yes, there is. Really practical, actually. Record memories. Record conversations, stories, just the sound of your loved ones' voices, especially if they're ill.
Why is that so important?
Because, according to the source, those recordings, those snippets of connection, they become like lifelines during the absolute depths of grief. They're essential for survival almost.
Wow. Okay. That's really valuable advice.
Yeah. And the source described the ongoing journey of grief not as some neat linear process, stages you move through.
No. How then?
More like this
Yeah.
aimless, hollow feeling that just is. It's there. And you oscillate. You have really bad days where you're just completely non-functional, need to switch off entirely. And then you might have good days, days where you genuinely feel happy to be alive again.
Yeah.
It's a constant back and forth.
And therapy is mentioned as being important.
Absolutely critical. Having that professional support to help navigate such overwhelming emotions.
Yeah.
And there's also a brief mention of the spiritual side of things in the source.
Yeah.
Maybe sensing something more, like seeing the glory of God or other realms when someone is close to transitioning.
Okay.
And how eventually, after a period of deep mourning, there could sometimes be a shift towards celebrating their spirit, their journey, rather than just mourning the loss.
So if someone listening is going through grief or knows they might face it soon, what's the biggest takeaway from the source?
Community. The absolute critical, non-negotiable need for community.
Having people around you.
Yes. Because there will be times, the source suggests, when you literally cannot care for yourself. You need people. Friends, family, support groups, whoever your people are.
So investing in those relationships now
is absolutely vital. It's what sustains you through the absolute hardest times imaginable. Ultimately, the source frames this kind of profound loss as, well, a transformational experience. It strips you bare, reveals who you truly are.
and forces you to ask, okay, who am I going to become now?
Exactly. What happens next?
Wow. We've covered so much ground today. Really deep dives into the power of boundaries for just basic self-respect.
That incredibly tough but ultimately freeing journey of forgiveness, especially around breaking those damaging family cycles.
Yeah. And the vital importance of learning to actually listen to and nurture your own inner intuition.
That inner guide. And finally, exploring that profound, often just devastating, but ultimately maybe transformative process of healing after huge loss.
These aren't really separate topics, are they? When you think about it, they all feel deeply connected.
Not at all separate. They all speak to this ongoing work, I think, of building a resilient life. a life guided by, hopefully, inner wisdom and self-compassion.
Especially when you're navigating the tough stuff, the pain and challenges that life inevitably throws our way.
Yeah. And circling back to that idea of intuition for a moment,
Mm.
the source had that really fascinating point, remember, that your inner guide, that potential best friend inside you.
It might actually stop talking to you if you consistently ignore it.
Exactly. Like it needs proof you're actually listening, that it can depend on you to pay attention.
Which kind of leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? Something for you, the listener, to maybe sit with.
Yeah. If that inner guide is always there, waiting to connect, but it retreats when it's ignored, what might it be whispering to you right now, in this very moment?
What message might you be missing because the line isn't quite open?
And maybe the real question is, how will you commit, starting today, even in small ways, to nurturing that vital connection within yourself, to tuning in?